Hey everyone, welcome back to episode 45 of the Weekly Boost podcast. Ben and I again, here to talk about some early science education, some of the things that we are kind of thinking about right now in the grand scheme of, how STEM is sort of incorporated in our lives, even after the big STEM movement that we kind of went through as children and young adults, as well as some kind of cool science fiction turned science reality type stuff with our humanity's trip to Mars and, the first manned remote controlled mission with helicopter flight on Mars as well. So we're just going to be talking about a whole bunch of cool science stuff. Yeah, hopefully you guys will enjoy and want to come along for the ride. I know I've been really excited to talk about this week's episode. So
Yeah, it's well, when you kind of came up with this idea for it, and because we've talked a lot about like existential stuff and
yeah.
talked a little bit about like space stuff and how vast it is, and you kind of put it into perspective and think about it that way. But also this whole having or getting to school and the TV on the cart was in the room.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And you're like, okay, this is going to be great.
Yep.
You had some of those, the Bill Nye and other people like that. And it's those are exciting times. I remember.
Yeah, they were. And what's unfortunate is that new generations of individuals going through, early education aren't going to be able to get that nostalgic feeling of the TV roller cart.
Yeah.
It's going to stink because, believe it or not, a lot of our early science foundation and our early understanding was from Bill Nye. Like, when you heard Bill Nye the Science Guy come on TV, it was going to be a good Friday because you're going to either learn something that you never knew before, kind of a waste of time for the class, depending on what your, what your interests were in science. So I don't know, for me, it was always a pretty cool day. And that kind of gets us into like our first topic, just talking about early STEM education and the importance of it, because we talked about on a lot of our episodes, the idea of like the whitewashing of science, and the idea that like a lot of the individuals that have discovered a lot of the things that we kind of take for granted today as scientists were, of the, Caucasian male demographic. And so kind of diversifying this area of expertise and education is essential. And we've been doing a lot better job, when I say we, I talk about everybody, we're doing a lot better job of integrating diverse peoples and especially underserved minorities. We see this a lot with admissions into universities, but it's all a good thing because obviously of stuff that we've talked about in the previous episodes. It's important. So
I liked what you said, that kids aren't getting that same feeling, right? Because you walk in, the smart board's there anyway. Like, are they going to use it for a movie or for a lesson or whatever? So there's a lot of things like that we can go on about I think like we're just like on rocking chairs on a porch, just like
my chair moves back and forth a little bit, so we're already almost there.
No, I was gonna say, like, I think it's really important, and I don't know if you saw like on Netflix, there's like a remake of the Magic School Bus, and the original one's on there too.
I think I saw that.
There's always been this kind of push for early education for STEM topics, and I think, like you said, there's obviously still much more work to be done in providing equal opportunity to everyone.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's shows on Netflix like Emily's Wonder Lab, which is like inspiring young girls and boys, but seeing the head and the host of the show is this super educated, I think she's an aerospace engineer. She's just super passionate about getting this word out that like, I'm here, you can be too. And I think it's again another topic for us. It's like hard to comprehend. We talked about it a couple episodes ago, where it's like we're already, like, we've seen people like us in those positions, and I think now we see people kind of taking that lead where it's not necessarily just people like us. It's given the right opportunities, anybody can succeed. It's essentially that shift, I guess, and even in our lifetime too, it's been making great strides.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that held back STEM for the longest time is because it was hard. like just understanding things that at one point, believe it or not, were fictional. Like people thought that stuff like this couldn't happen. We have geocentrism, where for the longest
Yeah.
time everybody thought that the Earth was the center of the universe, and then the transition to heliocentrism. Like you see those topics, and you're like, wait a minute. For probably close to latter half of 3/4 of humanity's existence on Earth, we thought that the Earth, or at some point the Earth, was the center of the universe. And so kind of that transition is a fun topic to talk about too. But
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to get into the difficulty in access to STEM, because we are seeing it a lot with the differences and the inaccessibility to internet, with people living in rural and urban settings. And I think that kind of goes hand in hand with the accessibility to science, because you and I are both from rural Wisconsin. And I just think it's hard for people to back and get behind something that they don't think that they'd have access to, because they're just so, they're caught up in either geological locations, or they just, the nearest, place where like the stuff that they could learn about is actually being used is far away. And so it becomes less of a reality to understand. And so I think that that's another contributing factor to, what has held STEM back in the past, on top
Sure.
of, racist movements and kind of I remember we talked about it in another episode, but the whole idea of sexism too. Rosalind Franklin's, DNA crystallography experiment, that big thing, that's probably one of the more well-known. I'm sure there's instances that occurred throughout the history of human existence where sexism made things difficult on other people, but that one, it stands out because it's not more recent, but pretty big.
Yeah,
Understanding DNA is literally what we are, who we are, as DNA is the building block of like everything in us. So that's kind of a foundational thing to be a headline for equality in science. So
yeah, I think I'm obviously in this field, but like highlighting those stories is important too, but not like finding a happy medium where you're not like totally discrediting someone or things like that. And I think you bring up a good point with like access to STEM too, because I feel like there was always this kind of like stigma around it, right? Like you had to be super, super smart and like dedicated from the beginning to do it. And I think also, I don't know about you, but there's times where it's like science and like math and everything was just like boring.
Yeah.
Like you don't like, at least for me, because I was always kind of interested in like history, but then also I think what really did it for me for science was like the frog dissection in like 7th grade. That's what did it. I was like, this is super interesting. And like, so like that's what I can physically remember. I transferred to a public middle school, and like that was one of the things we did in the spring. So I can kind of pinpoint it. But for a lot of people, it's like sometimes it's like this out of reach major or like interest that's hard to grasp and fully kind of like conceive as a future. And it's like, well, I wouldn't want to work in a lab all the time or what have you. And I think because lab work, I know you're all about it, and maybe this transitions a little bit, but it's definitely kind of like, as much as you interact with people, it's still kind of a lonely thing, right? You're in the lab for hours on end. I think the other day you were telling me that the experiment didn't go well, so you're back in there again. And I think STEM is also this like painstakingly long process, and as it should be, right? Because it's all about understanding how the world works. And like what you said with Rosalind Franklin, it's like that's what looking back on STEM is so interesting to me, because it's like, in the what was it, 16th century, Copernicus, comes out with this idea of, maybe the sun is the center of the universe. And like you start like thinking, it's like everything falls into place. And I know it's easy to look back on history that way, but it's just so intriguing. And when you come down here like permanently, we'll have to get to the history of science collection so we can see some of Galileo stuff. Like they have handwritten notes from him and stuff, and they have a really good collection there. And you start to see this like this arc of how we understand the world around us. And I think that it kind of culminates with the Perseverance mission, where it's like so many people that are like, okay, well, why do we need to go to Mars? Like, why is all this? And we'll get into it later, but I think it's just like such a cool thing to reflect on and understand how we understand, what we're doing today, especially, in a pandemic, in this or that, or like even with like cancer research, right? Like, why don't we have a cure for cancer, all cancers, right? And there's a brief video I saw today, and it was like, well, one, they're your own cells, and there's multiple different types of cancers that they're just like the processes of uncontrollable replication. So it's like the different types of cancers and different processes are all different, like drugs or I don't know, the different cures, I guess, that would have to happen. And like chemo just takes over the whole body. It's like when you take ibuprofen, like it just kind of suppresses whatever, and like chemo targets your whole entire body. That's why there's a vast array of adverse reactions to it. But sorry, I'm kind of rambling. But
no, you're good. No,
I think it's just stuff. Like interesting to kind of like look back on this arc and how we understand. And you kind of like put it in perspective too. Like we don't even know. The majority of human history wasn't recorded already, like to this point. So it's like, and all of those, people to a certain point through, whatever is like, are capable to speak and have, language capabilities and able to kind of form, these tribes or civilizations or whatever. And we don't even know about it. And much less we don't even know about all these other universes and like planets and stuff. So it's like a really humbling.
It's a fun topic.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's why it's fun, because you're exactly right. It humbles you because you think, I don't want to say you as if like I'm targeting a certain individual, but more of like myself. Yeah. Soldier Boy. But the idea that our hubris, I guess, is what it is our hubris builds us up, makes us this really grand figure in the grand scheme of everything that has ever existed, and then something happens to knock it back down a notch. I love that dynamic because like I said, we like to be grand and we like to be, the top of the food chain, the top of everything, and then something happens where it's like, wait a minute, maybe we aren't as big as we thought. And like the whole idea about Mars, we manned a remote controlled helicopter flight on a planet, that like our distant brother or sister of a planet type deal. But like, wow, that's only like the small stone in the bottom of the ocean of things that we have the potential to do. It's like, the sky's the limit. Literally, that phrase is one of my favorites because you can only go so far up, but we always have to be prepared for those things that don't go our way. And that's what STEM, I think, teaches us the most, is that failure is okay. Failure is probably the greatest learning tool in the history of the universe. And I know I'm sounding pretty, third grade history of the universe. But it is, because you and I have learned this in baseball. It's a game of failure. You and I have learned this in STEM. It's, a path of failure in order to understand bigger picture things. Even if your previous information is wrong, you still more know about it because you attempted it. And it's all about the process and not the result type of deal. The results are important, but the process is where I feel like you learn the most about what you're trying to get into. And so, I'm going to get off my soapbox because then I'll get back to, just being how tall I am now.
Humbled.
Humbled down. My hubris is showing, sorry. But it's a great topic, and I'm really happy we're able to bring this one to you because I could go on for hours about this one.
No, like the idea of like getting off your soapbox is funny to me because it's not like you need one to be tall.
Yeah, but, exactly.
Like, what were you saying? You're saying something about what was the gist of your thing? I'll edit this out.
Just like that STEM is okay. It's okay to fail.
Yeah. I appreciate that notion of like weaving sports back into it, right? Because they teach us so much, and our paths to in education and higher education, and you do learn significantly more through failure, I think. And this falling in love with the process, and you have to love lab work to do it. Right. Like it takes a certain kind of person, so long hours in the lab, and you can do all the administrative stuff on the side, whatever, but when it's just you and the instruments and the chemicals and the pipettes and you like, you really, it's a moving experience too. Like when, like, let's say when you, that first experiment, when you extract your cheek DNA, right, in high school biology, right? You're like sitting there, like chewing on your cheeks, and then you like spit in this vial and like nobody, like whatever. And you like, once you understand like that whole thing and you're like, wow, that's in, like, you can physically see it. I think that's a huge thing for people too, is
Yeah.
seeing is believing, as cliche as that is, like
Yeah.
you see the science at work, or like, even if you're like looking on how species have changed over time, and you see this, you actually see it and you're like, wow, the process is really worth something.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, how do we get to, why don't we have a cure for this? Why don't we do, like, it's like, how painstakingly long this process is, and without like the checks and balances of it, like you said, you get knocked down a couple rungs on the ladder, and you're like, okay, well, now where do we go? And you have to kind of pick yourself up and think like, okay, well, let's try this for an experiment. And that's why like the history of experiments, or like discovering elements too, is just like so mind-boggling when you think about it. Like, these people are able to isolate and see atoms for how many or how many atoms are in this element, whatever it is. It's just like it's I don't know.
Well, I got a cool one for you, because you just brought up elements, and like, talk about an experiment that really situated us in the grand scheme of everything is Miller and Urey's experiment to kind of like understand what atmosphere was present at the time of the development of early life on Earth. And now that's something that's, there's up for debate, because you look at concentrations of gases in our atmosphere throughout, the span of time, and there's some that change, there's some that come and go. We contribute to certain types of gases that weren't there, hundreds of millions of years ago, and vice versa. Like it's a really, I want to say, liquid kind of situation. Everything's volatile is probably a good word for it. But like, these two individuals did an experiment inside of like a tiny little like bulb flask, and they just sealed it off, and they put these gases in there, and they did a couple sets of quantitative experimentation, and changed percentages and concentrations of all these gases, and then came up with stuff that was plausible to grow life, like signs of the early life forms. So like your archaea and your early primitive bacteria, they were able to grow in this. And so it's like, hey, what did we just accomplish here? We accomplished something that not only physically dates mankind back to whatever, the evolutionary step that took place to kind of make us into what we are today, but even further back to the actual set of, congregations of cells coming together to form things. Like, they did that. And that was, almost 80 years ago, 80, 90 years ago. That was early 1900s type kind of experimentation. If not, I might be a little bit wrong with my dates, but just early in science, this stuff was, being put together about, let's add ammonium, or let's add water, or, methane or hydrogen to this, thing. And just like, hey, let's see if these make sense. And they were wrong, which is funny. They were wrong. They had two of the gases wrong, but, hindsight, again, we love that. Perfect vision. But it was like, hey, we have something here that could seriously mean something to people. And sure enough, it did. And I think that's what STEM does for a lot of people. But
it was in 1953.
Oh, okay. So still,
regardless,
that's still pretty good. They were able to sit there and postulate like, hey, this is the conditions for life at the birth of the planet. Pretty neat.
Well,
and then people will be like, how do you know? It's like, because science tells us this. Like, we can predate science. Yeah, science. But like, that question is great, because like, how do you know? It's like, well, we did a set of experimentations. The results, say this. We go by these results until proven otherwise. That's how science works. Like, that's how you get to that, stepping stone of, the evolution of scientific discovery. It's like you start with what you have experimentation for and the results, and you go with that until there's another experiment that disproves it. Or it's kind of like a evolving thing, as if just like life evolves, around us. So,
well, I just, when I looked up when it was, this article comes up from 2009, when two scientists kind of added this new dimension to this debate on how life was formed. And again, like you said, like, it's this process of kind of uncovering the how and the why, right? And I think that's an easy way of kind of describing what science is. But I'm curious to kind of read this, and I don't want to kind of take
like, just talk about like a daunting experiment, because you're dealing with stuff that was like hundreds of millions, if not billions of years ago. Like, how do you sit down and think like, stuff like this today, it's probably different than what was back then, at the birth of our planet. So how are we going to fill in the gaps? Like, to me, that is just, it's mind boggling that, in the 50s of all times, like, I know that's like kind of the new scientific era of like the century, is like when like you start seeing a lot of cool stuff coming out in the 50s and, jumping forward. And that's kind of getting into our, a topic we'll discuss later, but man, I could go on for days about science. It's pretty cool stuff. And
well, it's never ending too. Like you could fall into, they joke about YouTube rabbit holes. Like you could easily get into a Google Wikipedia rabbit hole, and it's like,
that's kind of what like this was. So I was reading Neil deGrasse Tyson's new book, Cosmic Queries, and I kind of just noticed this tiny little paragraph about this experiment that we were just mentioning, and like how it was only dedicated to a paragraph. And now if Neil deGrasse Tyson incorporates it, I feel like it's relatively important to discuss, in his terms of like his book. But like this was one of the hundreds of cool topics that you don't normally sit down and like think about. You kind of just take for granted, like, oh yeah, we're breathing this oxygen, we're in this nitrogen mix and all this sort of stuff. It's like, hey, let's just sit down and look at something for 25 seconds. Because all it took was for me to Google search Miller and Urey's experiment, and there I was, the rabbit hole. I was learning about, early gases. I'm like, okay, why am I learning about this? I should be, outside like golfing or something. But no, here I am. So I think that's my last soapbox moment. But I think STEM really does a great job of being diverse, having a lot of variety in what you want to talk about. And a lot of things do, like, literature studies, history studies too, like what you're going through. You could have picked a multitude of eras, time periods, things to talk about. The same with science. And I think that's beautiful, because I transitioned from cancer biology to microbiology. Obviously there's, connections between the two, but vast differences, because one's talking about the human organism, and then the other one's talking about the things that we can't see that infect us and our pathogens and whatnot. Like that stuff is, apples and oranges and almost most of the characteristics that we can talk about it. But like, it's such a variable field of study that I think it's beautiful. It allows for people to be creative in what they want to do.
Yeah.
And,
in math,
in science, it's really hard to be creative as it is. Like STEM, hard to be creative unless you're like in a building science, like engineering, where you actually engineer, you're sitting down and, thinking of ideas. Like, like it's, believe it or not, it's hard to be creative. That's why I'm not good at it.
Well, it's also daunting too, like hearing all these other experiments. It's like, okay, well, how did they come up with this?
Yeah.
Like, how did they think like, hey, what if I do this, this, and this, and you find like answers to whatever. Like it's a very, like I said, it's a daunting thing to get into, because you go through this long process and you don't get the results, and then you're like, okay, well, I got to publish in 2 months. What do I do? Like, I don't have, results. And then you run it again and you don't have results. And it's like, but there's always something you can take from it. And I think that's also another really gratifying point too. And it's, but why don't we transition here? Because I really want to hear about what you think about this, because I have some opinions, but like, we talked about this, the Perseverance going to Mars. Like, where do you stand on this? And I know our opinions probably aren't worth anything, but I think it's a good conversation, because think about all the issues that kind of are given so much light on Earth, right? And we have poverty and all these other things but here we are investing, what is it? What figure did you have in here in the notes? Like $10 billion?
Yeah.
Right. Or like, it's just absurd amount of money, right? That they privately fund and then also publicly, put money towards in the budget. And like, where do you stand on these like huge projects that might not kind of render anything? Do you think it's better off using resources on Earth? Like, where do you stand?
So I'm gonna tone it down to like a smaller sample size to kind of get an idea of like the bigger picture. I know there's some conditions and variables missing in this, but so I'm a graduate research student, and my research is funded by the NSF. So like that's a pretty big outlet for research funding. And so granted, they could pay me to go do research on something that may or may not have really big implications for either human life or quality of life, all these sorts of things. Like it may or may not have that. You take a risk at doing it, or they could invest in something that's known to have significant attraction. Like how about lowering the cost of tuition for an individual student, like I know it's fractions on the dollar type of a deal, but like there's things that like, okay, we know that this is a direct important factor or impactful thing that people have to deal with in order to do this stuff. So kind of flip-flopping that to like, why are we spending money on something that we don't know if it's ever gonna come to fruition for the human race? Well, I personally believe that it's okay to be a dreamer and it's okay to be creative, and the idea of like space, something that we know very little about but almost engulfs the entirety of our daily life. I think it's worth knowing rather than like just letting it be and kind of trying to dwell inside. There's obvious things that we need to fix, like things that we can change about the human condition that make it better for everybody. Like we have to allocate resources from that, or allocate resources to that. But at the same time, trips to the moon and trips to Mars, I think they stand for something that shows, again, the hubris of human race, of humanity, that if we set our mind to something, we can accomplish it, and sort of gives a culmination feeling, like that we were able to funnel this all together and come out with something that stands for humanity, what we are as a organism. Because whether we like to think it or not, we are the only known sentient organism on our Earth. Like on Earth, like there could be, if we could do a whole aliens episode if we wanted to, but like we're the number one because of our hubris, but also because we're just sentient. Like we think we're superior, so we are, kind of a mentality. And so like we have to do these things. But that's kind of a roundabout answer. I don't know. I like the idea that we can sit down and send something up to Mars, remote control it, hundreds of thousands of miles away. Mm-hmm. And I personally think that's pretty cool. Like, again, the fact that we can take science fiction and turn it to science reality I love that phrase. Science fiction to science reality. I think it's in itself is worth it. But
I agree that there are like greater things, right? That I just I see both sides of it too, because it's very it's especially if you're struggling, right? Yeah. If you're living paycheck to paycheck and then you're like, okay, why are we spending all this money? And especially when they put a dollar amount on, like, through journalism stuff, right? They they'll put a dollar amount. The project goes with this whatever.
Yeah, the project costs $86 million. It's like, okay.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's like, well, if world hunger could be solved with X amount of, I think, didn't they put like a number on it? It's like
they couple billion or something. Well, they do that with a lot of stuff too. Like veteran homelessness in the country could be like solved with X amount of money, and then you pull it next to the the 1%. That's talking about like a kind of corporate sector Bernie Sanders kind of a conversation.
Yeah.
But like you talk about it, the world's homeless population could be solved with X amount of money. It's like, okay, how do you put a dollar sign on that? But at the same time, maybe people can come together like and figure something out. But again, we live in a really polarizing time where these conversations are difficult, and science is at the forefront of those conversations most of the time. So.
Yeah, I think, but like space travel too, like you said, is just kind of can be this unifying thing. And I think, I remember where I was when the SpaceX launched last May?
Yeah.
Right? I remember, and like I kind of, not that I like cried, but like I like got emotional in a sense, because it was like, wow, like it's been how long? The space shuttle program's been discontinued since. What was it, like I don't want to say it and
be wrong. Well, be wrong. You bring up a good point while you're looking this up. The idea of like the risk that we've had, like with the Challenger, right?
Exactly.
There's that risk. Like we put human lives at risk every time we send somebody up there. So it's like obviously there are things that we have to kind of weigh. We have to put into a balance of like, okay, how worth it is it to go to the moon again, or how worth is it? How much worth is going to Mars? Like we have to like put these things in a monetary value, and it's hard for me because it's like I wish money is almost to the point in my life where it's just all like in like the cloud, right? It's just like we'll almost never see the money that we have. Like when you and I get our grants, or like when we get like student aid, they put a dollar sign on it, but what does it really mean? Is it like a discount, or like do we ever get the money? So I'm starting to like have that really, fantastical view of money, that idea that it's just I'll never hold it. So it's starting
I think so the space shuttle retired in 2011, right?
Okay.
But like for me, it was like it's hard in the beginning. It was hard for me to fathom another like aircraft sending people into like to the International Space Station.
Yeah.
That wasn't the space shuttle. Something that's modern looking and
iconic. It's literally like the icon of space travel,
especially like for us when like we're seeing some of these flights like in our classrooms, right? I don't know the exact one, but like especially for people like older than us too that like witnessed several or the two major kind of accidents. It's like there again is like this point of inflection where it's like, okay, what are we doing? Like, why do we need to do this when, especially like when the first go, like with the space race, right? In the 50s into the 60s, it's like, okay, well, we have all these issues, civil rights and just like poverty and all these issues on within our own borders. Why are we trying to prove ourselves to the Soviets? And I think that's a larger like ideological kind of argument and like reason for it. But at the end of the day, when we see those pictures with the overview effect, and we talked about it too, like you're looking back for the first time, you're like, wow, like this little marble in the middle of this black abyss is kind of important. Like, and we don't really get that feeling. Sorry.
No, you're good.
We don't really get that feeling by sitting here and seeing, going through the motions and, seeing people on the streets on our way to work, or seeing, people struggle and you like wish you could do something for them, but like you can't because you have to, like it's just this weird kind of, and you mentioned Bernie before and his whole reaction to the Jeff Bezos thing about like why, his kind of pushback on it. And just I kind of got into that like debacle a little bit with like just reading and following along with it. And it's like I see both points, right? And public funding, NASA has always been like a part of it, but it relies so heavily on private funding, so privatizing the industry doesn't necessarily fully like reverse what they were all about. But it's like I said, it's this interesting dichotomy of where to fall in on each side. Like what is too much, even like with the defense spending too, like what is too much for defense spending, and then why or we allocate funds for other things. And again, that's for people who are way over our pay grade in as graduate research assistants. But
well,
I don't know.
I think the conversation that you just sparked my interest in is the idea that we were a group of nomad hunter gatherers, pretty much at the cusp of our birth of what we are today. And why you get the question of, okay, why are you doing this science? Why are you doing anything really? It's because we inherently want better. We want the best for ourselves. And I think, in a convoluted way, these trips to Mars and these, this kind of commercializing space travel, I think these are ways to want or to accomplish that that need to be better. And again, I'm not saying that we got to sit down and devote every single penny to this because it's the ultimate reason, but I think it's important because you sit down, okay, I'm going to go through the motions, I'm going to go find my food, I'm going to go bring it back, and I'm going to eat it and sleep and repeat the cycle. Like where is the human condition benefiting from that besides pure survival? Like kind of the thing, it brings forth the idea of creativity, exploration. And I feel like that's essentially what we are, is we're explorers. Now, granted, the negative sides of exploration, colonialism, westward expansion, those obvious things are terrible. And I'm fearful of if we ever do encounter anything like that outside of our atmosphere, I hope our reaction is better than what it was at, 14th century and up kind of a thing,
Yeah.
like with, colonialism and stuff like that. So that does make me nervous. But one of the coolest things that I think that we can talk about with this is the idea that science, whether they're manned or whether they're remote missions to Mars, kind of bring up the idea of going against the grain, bringing in the idea that just because other people don't believe in it doesn't mean that you can't do it. And so that really cliche thing of like dreams becoming reality. Well, there you go. This is a pretty cool example of it.
Yeah.
Like Elon Musk sat down, however many years ago, and was like, I want to make a rocket that does this.
Go to Mars.
Let's go to Mars. He sat down with a mission, and whether or not you back the person or not, you have to say that he stuck to his guns and he did it. And he kind of accomplished something that literally nobody else has ever done. That's pretty cool. That's what science is like. That's what you can see that in science. Like, I discovered DNA. Like, that literally nobody ever knew about it. A, probably because early humans didn't care, or like B, it was just too difficult to do until things evolved around it. But again, like I could go on for days about this stuff. But
yeah, it's with the pandemic and with other things, as we kind of are starting to grow older and become more aware of living through historical moments, like that's another one. Like that'll be a paragraph in the history book where it's like 20 or nearly 20 years after the space shuttle program, like America finds a way to launch a program that gets back to the moon. And just seeing the news like recently with the G7 summit with leaders of the United States and Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the UK, like coming together. And like we kind of talked about before, it's like, has science and stuff kind of taken a back seat in previous years where we're wrapped up with other things, and then we come back to now, it's like, well, a worldwide pandemic was on the high list of things that could kind of, interrupt this like world that we're living in, and like other things that everyone's kind of warning about. And I think as we kind of see is however much of this G7 summit, like the publicity part has been kind of how much is fake, right? But I think symbolically it's an important kind of time as the world starts to recover and open back up again and find a way to be unified in certain ways. Like, yes, nationwide you're obviously different, right? And you're going to have dissent towards different places, but from a science background, I liked what you had in here about like kind of maybe we did fall behind, but like let's all kind of find a way, especially with like climate change and stuff, like find a way to take steps forward and not necessarily fall too many rungs down 10 years from now. But
kind of getting into that, like the falling behind thing, I wanted to talk about real quick about what do you think the impact was of the global pandemic on science? And the obvious answer was pretty big. It impacted a lot of stuff because experimentation can only be done, really in person, unless it's a lot of digitized, data collection, stuff like that. Like, it's really difficult to go in. I'm speaking personally because it was a challenge. Like, I couldn't do my research for, however long we were sent home for that semester. So like, obviously we're going to see some sort of regression of scientific discovery or, scientific truth, whether or not whatever one you want to talk about. But the thing that we can control is the the politicizing of it and how that is impacting. Because for the longest time that I have been kind of paying attention to this stuff, almost every scientific topic that I see break the news has some sort of side that people take on it. And granted, you can talk about like the whole COVID-19 pandemic itself was about as polarizing as you could think of as a topic for this. But I think it was based off the reaction more or less than the actual, disease itself. I feel like people, for the most part, genuinely cared. I know there was a lot of comparison to flu season and all sorts of stuff, but it killed individuals and a lot of people's loved ones, and it impacted people's lives. And I feel like that was something that we could talk about. But I think the reactions, of how we could handle it were different. And I feel like that just over triumphed everything. And that was hard for me because it was like, okay, well, I'm trying to sit down and figure out the science behind it. Like, hey, I'm going to bring up this topic, but then people get into the weeds about like, oh, well, if the government didn't do this, or if the government did this, like we'd be in different. It's like, okay, well, we can play the if game all the time, but I'm going to try to sit down and do this and figure out the science, but it has to be politicized. And now some things have to be obviously incorporated in the political atmosphere because, you know, impacting of the human condition is important and certain things do that. But that rabbit hole is for another day.
Well, and you know, it reminds me of kind of when all that leaked about the NIH funding coronavirus project in you know, a variety of places, and Wuhan happened to be one of them. Like, you know, politicizing where it's, you know, I'm not too versed in it, so I won't, you know, try to like be this expert. But to my understanding, it sounded like the NIH was funding a variety of places on research for like ways to, you know, learn more about these types of viruses. So if it were to jump to a person, we like have this head start on how like, but there again, like because of politicizing it and politicizing where this funding, there's funding again too. Like, what are we doing with our money? You know, it feeds that that conspiracy theory that it developed and was like made and released from the lab, which has been, you know, disproven by scientists. It's just like, it's a very I don't know, it's hard to kind of depoliticize something when, you know, funding and all that gets determined by political leaders.
Exactly what you're talking about.
But you did say something about like there's going to be a regression for science, you know, research coming up, but I don't know if that's necessarily true, because if it teaches us anything, it's like infectious disease, still we need to know a lot about it. And you know, as miraculous as it was to kind of create like 4 different vaccines in a year, you know, it's still, like we talked about, it's work from previous people that was funded by the government. I'm sure, like how much of those projects were, or how many of them were privately funded? Probably not a whole lot. So I think, you know, this, like we talked about public health and science, is always going to be politicized and used as a weapon. And as kind of depressing as that may sound, it's just kind of the way it has to be when there's funding involved. But
now that rabbit hole is kind of covered up, I want to get back to one more thing about going against the grain, and it has to deal with space. And it was a really cool thing for me to research, because I know how much not how much you're invested into this, but like you spend a good amount of time reading about this individual and kind of, you know, what he did for the country in a short time. But I want to talk about a little bit of JFK's mission to get men on the moon. The idea of going against the grain, because I was pulling up some statistics and stuff like that, just trying to look away at ways to understand this. But to kind of start it off, technology at the time, even to conceptualize landing a man on the moon, how just radical that is. Because if you want to, you know, that's the 1960s I'm talking about. It was like the you know, the lunar projects and all that sort of stuff. 30 years prior, we barely had roadways to get across our country. Now, thanks to Dwight D. Eisenhower, we had, you know, interstate highways. Interstate highways before. Well, funny reasoning for it is for actually military travel across our country is what the main use for interstate highways was. And so kind of that transition to actual, you know, commercialized transportation is in itself a great topic of discussion. But when JFK set out to make, you know, his goal of getting the men on the moon, 58% of the American people opposed the Apollo missions. So going against the majority of people, they're like, hey, this is pretty much useless, waste of money. Kind of, we can allocate resources to not Cold War stuff, but getting into fighting other fronts, I guess. And so, well, set out and unfortunately cut down in his prime, probably one of the closest representations to a generation around our age and the president, you know, ever. That's going to be, that's in itself another conversation. But the idea that he set out to do something, and was it 1969?
Well, he announced it in 61.
But in 69,
But yeah, it was in July of 69 that they landed on the moon. But at the time of the announcement, I couldn't imagine what the reaction would be, because I'm just looking, like the amount of time that Americans had spent in space had barely been 15 minutes. And you're telling me 8 years later, we're going to, 8 years and 2 months, we're going to land someone on
sustain
the
a
moon.
flight to land somebody on the moon.
3 people
It's
on the
like,
moon. Like, come on.
I'm going to be honest with you. I would have sat down and been like, okay, whatever,
Yeah.
man.
Well, especially
Like,
if you didn't vote for him too, right?
Yeah,
Like, let's say you were a huge
yeah,
Nixon proponent
yeah,
at the time. You're like, okay, like, cool, Jack. Like, who
yeah,
cares? Like,
yeah,
let's go
exactly.
spend money over here and just keep, wasting, all
Yeah,
these millions of dollars. But it's just a powerful thing. And again, Cold War driven. And I think,
yeah,
I don't know exactly. Like, part of my research, I was like kind of hearing some of like the not lost tapes, but tapes from conversations
yeah,
of Kennedy, and his like kind of initial hesitance for like, okay, well, where are we at with like the space race? Like, what can we do? And
yeah,
I'm interested to look into this further, where it's
yeah,
like, how many of his camp was like, okay,
yeah,
like, Jack, maybe we
yeah.
shouldn't have kind of made that huge
Yeah.
promise.
And
But
again, it was probably one of the major proponents of our Cold War response. What can we be better than the Soviets at?
yeah,
And again, granted, Sputnik was the first,
so yeah,
outside of our atmosphere kind of vehicle of travel. But you look at it, you got human bodies on an object that billions of people have stared up at the sky.
yep,
And
the
it's
same
like,
thing.
wow, is it made of cheese? Like, what does it do? Like, all these questions stem from that. And it's like, hey, this person set forth a goal, and made reality out of something that people told him that he couldn't do. I guess that's kind of our like ending thing, is like, it's sometimes okay to go against the grain, because you'll hear the counter feedback that you need in order to correct the things that in your process may or may not be, correct. But at the same time, it gives you a cool little feeling of like, hey, remember when you told me that I couldn't do that 8 years ago? Now, granted, he was deceased at the time and all that sort of stuff, but I'm pretty sure if there was a place where he was looking down, he was pretty proud that, we did this.
Yeah.
Now, granted, the political reasons were, underneath it, but it's pretty freaking cool.
Yeah, it is. And it's funny. I'm reading these accounts from like the early 1900s, like every day pretty much, and it's like, yeah, we couldn't even cross the river because the bridges weren't stable, and like you had doctors and horses, horse and buggy up until like the 19 teens, and then all of a sudden, 50 years later, we're gonna have someone standing on that moon that's lighting your path. Like,
well,
it's incredible.
People played the game, the Oregon Trail. It's like, how many times like people get dysentery or something like that, or like cholera. Like, okay, do we not want to get rid of these things? It's like,
well, even that's what the 20th century, like, to me, is also so fascinating, because even like what I've been reading, it's like these oral interviews are taking place, like this huge collection. It's like recorded in 1955 of these like pioneer doctors.
Yeah.
So they've been in Oklahoma for 50 years.
Yeah.
And they're like, yeah, well, what's your hope for medicine in the future? Oh, we need to cure cancers. And like, this was their like big thing at the time. Like what you talked about, this like shift between, the types of disease. And it's like, well, people were really hesitant about getting, inoculated against smallpox and, the diphtheria antitoxin that they had, and like all these other things. And it's like, in just a couple decades, like even when you like break down history to think about like, okay, what were the 1900 like 1900 to 1910, like what are these about? And like you go from into the tens, and then with World War One, and then you go into the Roaring Twenties, and then you're Great Depression, and then all of a sudden you're World War One, and then like next we're on the moon.
Boom.
Like it's just like this. It's this rapidly moving progression, which is why it's such a an interesting topic to look into. And I guess we can kind of
one last one. This is probably one of the more relatable to everybody that you know. Well, not everybody that you know, but a lot of people in our time. But this thing right here, this thing is like 1,000 times stronger than the first computer, and like more powerful. Like imagine, like in what's granted, this fits in your pocket. Yeah, sorry. This fits in your pocket. The supercomputers that I'm talking about from, the 70s and 80s made like buildings dedicated, rooms and buildings. So like, wow. And you want to know what it was? Is somebody's like, hey, let's try to do this. And they sat down and everyone was like, you're crazy. Like, okay, if I'm crazy, so be it. I'm going to do this. And now, granted, we're not making good light of all these really radical, terrible ideas.
Yeah.
Like, there's obvious things that are not just okay. No, we're going to say no. But for the vast majority of these things that we're talking about are positive in some light, but there's the clear ones that not good. But
well, we've talked about the social media and dangers of technology and stuff like that.
But you hear like the major thing that I'm trying to stray away from is eugenics, like that idea. Like that was the most terrible thing ever, and like I don't condone any of that, but like that's what I'm trying to not bring light to.
Yeah,
because that is very much so a not good place for science.
And I had talked to one of my professors about it, that like eugenic, like the German like system for it, and so it was, some of it's largely based on American strides towards it. So
in the early 20s, like 10s and 20s, it was a big thing over here. I was actually reading accounts of it from one of the books. I think it's She Has Her Mother's Laugh by Carl Zimmer. It's a really great book, and he's talking about early genetics and stuff like that. And there, of course, that conversation has to be made, but stuff like that.
One last question for you. When you are motioning to someone that you are on the phone, how do you do it? Like I'm on, thank you. Okay, good. You're not like, have you seen those videos where it's like people are like,
yeah, no,
like they hold like a cell phone?
What's funny is like I don't remember the last time that I had to do this, but I'm doing receiver sender kind of thing, like speaker receiver kind of like that. That's all that is. But so I want to wrap up this episode. Really great conversation. I was super excited to come up with some of these topics and kind of include you in the conversation because science has been not at the forefront of my discussions, but it's been something that's always been keeping my heart tick and stuff like that, kind of keeping it going. But one of the cool things that I've come across recently, and we mentioned his book earlier, but Neil deGrasse Tyson actually has a podcast of his own. He is the director of the Hayden Planetarium too, so kind of some cool space talk, but it's called Star Talk Radio. Great podcast. I listen to it a lot when I'm mowing grass at work. Talks about these really cool existential questions that we kind of bring up, like why do we want to go to this? Why do we want to go to the moon again? Like what more can we find there? But I think these conversations need to be had in order to let STEM progress the way it's supposed to. Because again, people sit down and it's like, well, why do we need to allocate research and funds to these? It's like, we want to be better. Either A, in understanding, or B, in human condition. We just want to be better. And I think that's great. Now, granted, we have to not let our hubris, kind of take control, but I think it's a great proponent of it. But this is another great conversation. Really happy to bring this one to you. And we'd like to thank you again for your support through our ACS campaign in May. Couldn't have done it without you guys. We raised good money for a good cause. And we can't say thanks enough to that, because it made us feel good about doing it, even on top of the feel good that we were already gonna help, and do that. But it proved that there were people out there that are willing to, help a good cause. And I'm happy that our fellowship supported us in that. So thank you.
Catch you next week.